Hi, welcome back to the Basic English Grammar course. Now we're going to be talking about punctuation, which punctuation is something that doesn't come quite as naturally to us. It's something that a lot of people tend to have a lot more issues with. The previous information, even though you don't know all the technical terminology, English speakers will know how to use these things, but punctuation gets a lot more tricky, so we're going to spend a lot of time on it. So punctuation's purpose is to define and point to grammatical structures in a sentence. And punctuation acts as sort of the rhythm of a sentence. So when we speak, we're using punctuation, but we don't really realize it because punctuation and speaking go hand in hand. We have a natural rhythm in how we talk. And so when we write, we kind of sometimes forget that we're writing with the same rhythm we talk. And so punctuation needs to indicate the same things that we indicate when we talk. And so this is why a lot of people forget to use punctuation correctly. So it's very easy to form bad habits with punctuation because, again, it's mostly an item of rhythm. So punctuation rules change fairly often as well. So that's another reason 20, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, all these punctuation marks were used slightly differently. So if you learn grammar, in one decade, it's going to be different the next. So it's always a good idea to keep up with this, especially punctuation. Punctuation changes the most frequently out of any other grammar rule. So it can be just as important, if not more important, than word choice. Because with language etiquette, you're going to look like you don't know what you're talking about if you don't know how to use punctuation. So periods, this is the most basic punctuation. Periods appear at the end of a sentence, usually a thought. Periods are also used to abbreviate. So they abbreviate certain words and phrases, although not always. So you see it in cases like MD, medical doctor, etc., e.g., IE, the US. You see doctor and Mrs. So periods don't just have to be used at the end of a sentence. They can be used in abbreviations. Many acronyms do not use periods. A lot of people will mistakenly put them in. So like NASA, the FBI, UNICEF, none of these will use periods in them because we pronounce them as words. And it varies case by case. So whenever you're writing anything like an acronym, just keep that in mind. So when abbreviated phrases appear at the end of a sentence, another period is not used. So if you, for example, you end a sentence with etc., you put a period at the end, you don't put an extra period. So when other punctuation is used at the end of a sentence, like an exclamation mark or a question mark, signifying action or signifying a question, the period will go away and it's replaced. So periods also appear in the ellipses, but this is actually a different punctuation mark. So don't get it confused because it's the same key on your keyboard. It's actually a different piece of punctuation. So commas are probably the next most common piece of punctuation. They indicate a brief pause in speech. So this is when I speak of rhythm. Commas is really what's going to show up in the rhythm of your speech. So they aren't final like periods. They don't show the end of a thought. They pause it. So they separate thoughts, but not completely. These thoughts are still linked. So a comma suggests that two or more ideas have enough in common to appear in the same sentence. So commas have many different uses. We're going to talk about several of them. And they appear probably just as often as periods, if not more often. So they are generally responsible for replicating the varied rhythm in our speech and in written text. But because they appear so often, they are frequently misused and often omitted too. Commas should be used to separate three or more similar items or phrases in a list. So this is whenever you're listing something out and they all go together, commas separate them. So breakfast was toast, boiled eggs, and fried ham. And if you'll notice this last comma here before and, this is called the Oxford comma. There's actually been a lot of debate throughout English history of whether or not we need that comma. Some people prefer that you don't use it. Some people prefer that you do. So you don't have to. But I stand firmly on the side that says you need it, because what it does is it makes it clear exactly where the list stops. So most editors will also insist on it, because if you look at a sentence like this, you see the host set out chips and dip, cheese and crackers, and grapes. So if you read that without a comma, you don't know if it's chips and dip, cheese and crackers and grapes. So you don't know where to end that because cheese and crackers is one singular dish. Again, that would be like a noun phrase. So are nouns that are acting together as one unit. So with the Oxford comma, it becomes the host set out chips and dip, cheese and crackers, and dip. So you know these are 3 items. So commas also separate 2 consecutive adjectives when the adjectives are interchangeable. So if I say it was a sleek, lightweight car, I could also say it was a lightweight, sleek car. So in that case, you separate the adjectives with a comma. Comma splices are also called run-on sentences, and these occur when 2 or more independent clauses are joined together by, by a comma, but without a conjunction. So this problem can be fixed really easily. It can be made into 2 sentences with a period, or sometimes you can join the clauses with a conjunction. So an incorrect example would be, he ran home, the house was dark. So these are 2 complete thoughts. He ran home is a subject and a predicate. The house was dark, subject and a predicate. Neither one of these depend on another, and there's no conjunction. So you could say, he ran home, but the house was dark. So that's connecting that clause to the other clause. Or you could just say, he ran home, period. The house was dark, period. And so a dependent clause at the beginning of a sentence should be followed by a comma as well. So by the late 1800s, the red gazelle was extinct. So again, dependent clauses have a subject and a predicate, but they're dependent on something else to make sense. So whenever these appear, there's always going to be a comma. So by the late 1800s, this is describing when, the red gazelle was extinct. So those are, red gazelle was extinct could be its own sentence. By the 1800s could not. There will be a comma separating it. So there are exceptions to this rule, as there are with every rule in English grammar. If the introductory clause begins with a preposition, a comma may not be necessary. So you could say, into the sky it soared, into the road I fell. There could be a number of different ways you could put this. Usually, if it's really short, you might not need a comma.
We will resume this teaching after a short message from International School of the Word.
This teaching is one lesson taken from a full course on ISOW.org. If you are enjoying this video, we invite you to check out the full course in the links below. For the best value, try our All Access Pass. At just $99 per month, you can access thousands of hours worth of high-quality, world-class teaching. To check local pricing in your country, visit ISOW.org. For more great teachings like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel and follow us on our social media platforms.
Now, back to this teaching from International School of the Word.
So commas can also be used to set apart non-essential words or phrases from a sentence. But don't forget the second comma called the appositive comma. So this is when there's something you're inserting in a sentence that doesn't necessarily need to be there for the sentence to make sense. You'll separate it off with commas. So John, who is my friend, will meet you at the airport. So in this sentence, what you're really saying is, John will meet you at the airport. You give extra information saying, John, who is my friend. So this, as you hear in speech, is John, who is my friend. It's kind of like an aside. Will meet you at the airport. So non-essential can be really subjective and contextual. So sometimes you need further identification, and sometimes you don't. So using commas in this way is really going to depend on the case. So you could say, the dog who lives under the stairs is vicious. In this case, who lives under the stairs is essential, because you don't know which dog is vicious without it. You could say, the dog who lives under the stairs is vicious, and that would make it a different sentence. So in this case, it might not be clear which dog you're talking about if you don't have who lives in the stairs. So commas can also set apart a word or phrase injected into a sentence for emphasis. So you could say, it is, by the way, very important to remember your keys. Yes, good friend, I will. So this is kind of non-essential. It's an aside. And in this case, it's for emphasis, not just for extra information. So commas should be used to separate towns from states or countries. So whenever you're speaking of a town and the country or the state, you will use a comma between them. So we are filming this course in Cleveland, Tennessee. Commas should be used to introduce direct quotations. So whenever you're using a quote in a work, you say, when it was over, she said, comma, good day, friend. So anytime you're introducing a quote, you're going to have to use a comma. This separates it out, and this sort of makes there be a pause. So commas can sometimes separate statements from questions. So one whole sentence might have, again, a dependent clause that says, or an independent clause that has a subject and a predicate, and it can also be made into a question. So I did good, didn't I? So this is asking if you did good. It's all one sentence, but there's I did good, comma, didn't I? Commas can also separate two deliberately contrasted parts of a sentence. So if you want to show contrast between two clauses, you can separate them with a comma. I thought of the invention, not him. So this separates I thought of the invention, and it contrasts it to not him. So colons are another one that's often misused. They stand for that is to say, or here's what I'm talking about. So they define everything that comes before them. Colons and semicolons should not be used interchangeably, contrary to a lot of people's usage. So what comes after the colon should prove or explain what comes before it. As a rule of thumb, editors will disagree about this, but as a rule of thumb, everything that comes before a colon should be one complete sentence. Even if it might not make sense out of context, it should have a subject and a predicate. This is not a strict rule, but it'll prevent you from doing some errors with it, so this is why a lot of editors will suggest. But basically, the colon acts as a full stop and makes this pacing of the sentence seem awkward if you don't use it with a full sentence. So you could say, I need a hammer, some nails, and lumber. A lot of people will put, I need, colon, a hammer, some nails, and lumber. That would be the incorrect usage. So I need a hammer, some nails, and lumber. Or you could say, here's my list, colon, a hammer, some nails, and lumber. So colons, because they act as that full stop, really need to have something that makes sense in front of them. So colons also, what follows a colon should not be capitalized. So it's not a new sentence, anything that comes after, unless it's, of course, a proper noun. All of those are capitalized. So colons are often used in technical documents, ads, and outlines. So these won't appear like regular writing. So if you're writing an outline or if you're writing an instruction manual, you're not going to be writing the same way, and colons will appear in these. And in these cases, the rules for colons are a little bit different, and it kind of just depends on what you're going for, what your aesthetics are. So you might use the word example with a colon, and this is a case where you might not need to have a full sentence in front of a colon. So you'd say example, this, this, and this. So colons can be used also between two independent clauses when the second is crucial to the first. So you can basically, this is another way to work around a comma splice. One independent clause is crucial to the first, but there's still independent clauses that would work on their own. So he really deserved it, colon, he worked hard to win that championship. Now semicolons, exactly what they look like, it's part colon, part something else. So just like commas, they indicate a pause in a sentence. However, it's a longer, more defined pause. It's just short of a full stop. And the cases where you use these are a little bit different than commas. So they can link independent clauses without a conjunction. So kind of like the sentence I just showed you, you could say, there is a difference between country and bluegrass. It is a huge difference to some people. So you see how that second part of that sentence really kind of depends on the first to make sense. So here you don't necessarily have to use a conjunction. There's a lot of different options with this, but semicolons is one option. So there is a difference between country and bluegrass, and it is a huge difference to some people. So the semicolon should not be used when a dependent clause comes before an independent clause. So a lot of people will misuse semicolons this way. You'll see, when the morning comes, semicolon, I'll be gone. And see how that's kind of a longer pause? So you would use a comma in this case. So when the morning comes, I'll be gone. So again, dependent clause, independent clause. So when the morning comes depends on I'll be gone because it's when. And then I'll be gone could just be its own sentence again. So remember, independent clause. Semicolons are often used when a conjunctive adverb, like however, nonetheless, therefore, or furthermore, introduces a clause. So this is probably how it's taught in most elementary schools. And this is pretty much the only case they'll really teach you to use a semicolon because this is the easiest. So if you say, I'm going to take a walk, however, I'll be right back. So those are two clauses introduced by a conjunctive adverb. So semicolons can also separate listed items that have commas within them. So especially when talking about things like cities and states, this is when you'll use a semicolon to differentiate instead of a comma. So they come from Charlotte, North Carolina, semicolon, Albany, New York, semicolon, and Austin, Texas. And just like the Oxford comma, you need one more semicolon at the end before the last item. So what comes after a semicolon should not be capitalized. Again, it's still part of the same sentence. So unless it's a proper noun, it's not a new sentence.
Thank you so much for supporting our ministry. If this has blessed you, please say a prayer for us. And if you would like to give, we have 3 ways that you can do that. You can give online at isow.org/donate, or text the word give and the amount to 423-225-9022. That's 423-225-9022. You can also give through the mail at ISOW, 340 Paul Huff Parkway, Northwest, Cleveland, Tennessee, 37312. Thank you. God bless you, and may the Lord multiply your seed. Now back to this teaching from the International School of the Word.
Parentheses are most often used to separate a word or phrase used as an aside or used to define something mentioned in a sentence. So really, the difference between separating something with parentheses and separating something with commas is that what you're putting in parentheses is kind of downplayed. It's kind of like you're whispering it, and you should read the sentence as though what's in parentheses isn't there unless you need it. So you might say, find the shift lever located near the center console and shift into reverse. So what's important in that sentence is find the shift lever and shift into reverse. But you're assuming that your audience might need to know extra information. So you put it in parentheses, located near the center console. So we got the report today is the sentence. It wasn't bad, you might say, because you might assume that your audience is worried that it might have been bad. So this is extra information. It's downplayed. It's like kind of like you're whispering it. It's kind of like you're saying it aside. So while they seem similar to commas, remember, this is a lot less important than what comes in commas. So they can also surround a caveat or context for readers. So if readers need to know extra information, use parentheses when you think your reader just doesn't understand the sentence. Generally, any punctuation for a sentence will come after parentheses, except when that punctuation is used within the parentheses. So for example, if you say, I saw you in 1997, has it been that long, ? But it seems like yesterday. So that comma that appears there is going to appear outside of the parentheses. So brackets, a lot of people confuse brackets with parentheses and think they're interchangeable, but they're not. They're used mainly to add notes or to correct a quotation. And so brackets signify basically, they act like parentheses, but they signify that what is in the brackets is not actually originally from the quote. So, for example, in the Gettysburg Address, you might say 7 in brackets 87, because that's not what was said, 7 years ago. There's the 87. So anytime a quote is modified at all, bracket should be used. So according to Jones, the team hadn't won since 1980. In the real quote, he might have said, Jones might have said, they hadn't won since 1980. But for the reader, you want to make it a little more clear. So you put in brackets, extra information. They also used, although really rarely, they can also be used within parentheses as an extra set of parentheses. So if what's in parentheses has an extra aside within that, you'll use brackets. So quotation marks, this is another one that's really frequently misused. They're used to surround direct quotes. This is their main purpose. So again, commas are used to introduce direct quotes unless the quote is being used as an object or subject in a sentence. So that was when she said, comma, turn the volume up. So again, you're going to separate them with that little pause so you understand this is the quote. And again, this is speech patterns. We would make that pause so that you know what I'm saying is different than what she's saying. That's what that demonstrates. Or you could say, saying turn the volume up was annoying. So there you're not using it as a quote, you're using it as an object. So saying this was annoying. Periods, commas, and other punctuation used in a clause are always placed inside the quotation marks. So anything that's going to be used is going to be used inside the quotation marks, whether it appears in the quote or not. So now is not the time, he said. The exclamation mark is going to appear inside the quotation marks, not outside of it. So if the punctuation on either side of the quoted material is independent from it, so if it's not being used in the quotation, it's going to appear outside of it. So did you agree when he said that's ugly? So that's ugly was not a question when he said it. The sentence is, did you agree when he said it? So remember, replace with a pronoun. Did you agree when he said it? Put that question mark at the end, not within the quotes. So they're also used around titles of short compositions. So short is really subjective. A lot of people will argue about it, but usually like songs, short stories, these are usually placed within quotes, while movies and novels are italicized. So for quotes within quotes, use single quotation marks. So this is the same key as an apostrophe, but it basically just looks like a quotation mark in half. So this is just like brackets are used as parentheses within parentheses, single quotes are used as quotes within quotes. So for example, if you're quoting the Bible and somebody is saying something in a particular Bible verse, you might say, and he called his name Noah, saying, this one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands. So this is a separate quote right here. This is what he called his name Noah saying. That's what he's saying. But the quotation is still being quoted from somewhere, so the whole thing is surrounded in quotation marks. So note that quotation marks don't always have to be followed by he said. You don't always have to introduce quotes. You can use them independently. They still have to be quoted if it's being quoted from someone. So quotation marks can be used around technical terminology or terms defined in context of a sentence. So this is anytime you're defining something within the sentence that you're using it. So you might say, this part is called the solenoid. So that you would use quotations because you're introducing a new term. So you could say they call themselves the liberators. So this is what they call themselves. I'm defining it right here. They can also be used to signify that a word is being used unusually. Usually this is sarcastically. And so this is the case where a lot of people will misuse quotation marks. This is what it looks like you're doing. So if you say, my friend, the inspector, came by, what you're really saying is sarcastically, he's not my friend, I don't like him at all. And so when you overuse quotation marks, this is what it looks like you're doing. It looks like you're using it sarcastically. So if you put quotation marks around every part in a sentence, it sounds like it's a euphemism. It's if you say, my friend went to the store to buy some groceries, it sounds like you're saying, my drug dealer went and got me drugs. It sounds like you're being sarcastic. So quotation marks can also be used when writing about words, as you'll see me do a lot in this presentation. So whenever you're using it to separate it from a sentence. So this is, in this case, there and there are two different words. So I put them in quotation marks because I'm talking about them as words. Blue can be used as slang for depressed. So again, I'm using the word blue to define it here. Avoid using quotation marks for emphasis because really it's way easier to look like this than you think. It's going to look sarcastic. So apostrophes, again, this is the same key as a single quote, but it's not going to be the same quotation mark. An apostrophe is used to show where letters are missing in a contraction in a shortened word. So in the word does not, we usually shorten it to doesn't. An apostrophe is used to show wherever the missing letter is. So if you say I'm, what you're saying is I am, so I apostrophe am. The same thing also happens, we do this a lot with the year. So if you're talking about a 1968 Camaro, you can say 68 Camaro with an apostrophe signifying that something's been cut off. Also, when you're using shortened words that are spoken of shortly, so this is informal, but if you say something or I'm gonna, you're going to use an apostrophe there. So this is informal and shouldn't be used in anything that needs technical grammar. So the apostrophe can also be used to form possessive. So an apostrophe plus S forms the possessive of a singular noun, but plural nouns usually do not need the apostrophe. So, for example, here's a singular noun, the dog's leash. So you're talking about one dog's leash, a leash belonging to one dog. You're going to use an apostrophe S. But if you say the boss's office, still apostrophe S. It's one boss. If you're using the plural noun like teachers, it's going to be the teachers' classrooms. So you're going to have the apostrophe and not the added S. So it really depends. Not all plural nouns are this way. So like the children's books, it's going to be the children apostrophe S, the books belonging to the children. So apostrophes are not used to show plurals. So nouns made plural with an S will not have an apostrophe, except in rare cases when the plural of a noun may be confusing without one. So if you say the dogs, you don't use the apostrophe unless you're speaking of the possessive. So if you're talking about multiple dogs, this is going to be no apostrophe. The only case where this is an exception is, like I said, when it's confusing without it. So if you say cross your I's and dot your T's, it would look like you're saying cross your is and dot your t's without it. So you'd need an apostrophe. Hyphens glue words together that need no spaces. So this is when you really want to solidify a phrase. These are phrases that are really more concrete, that can't be divided. So when you say the car is state of the art, hyphens will glue all those words together. This is only in certain cases. So really you just kind of have to memorize what words are hyphenated and versus not, because they act the same as a noun phrase. So it just depends on the word. I'm on a 12-day fast. In any cases where you use a number and a time, you're going to use a hyphen. So typically hyphens are used to avoid confusion. So this is when you might want to say the car is state. You're not saying the car is state, you're saying the car is state of the art. So you really want to drive the point home that this is a phrase. So I might say, I have a concealed weapon permit, or I have a concealed weapon permit. So you don't know if I'm talking about my weapon permit is concealed, or I have a permit for a concealed weapon. So you might not always hyphenate concealed weapon, but in this case, because it's describing permit, you kind of need to. Otherwise, it's going to be ambiguous. So numbers and fractions are also hyphenated when spelled out when they're more than one word. So if you say 23 or 1/5, there's always going to be a hyphen there so that you know this is all one word. You don't want to say 20 and 3 as two separate words. That's one word glued together. So hyphens are also sometimes used to separate words from prefixes and suffixes. So this is things like ex, self, and all. Whenever these are added to a word, it's hyphenated. So if I say my ex-wife, that's hyphenated. If I'm self-made, self-propelled, whatever the case may be, that's always hyphenated. And all, it's like all-knowing, all-seeing, those are always hyphenated. Prefixes are also hyphenated when there's two consecutive vowels. So if I say semi-intuitive, semi isn't always hyphenated, but when there's an I at the beginning of the word, it will be to avoid confusion so it doesn't look like, you can't pronounce it if it's not hyphenated. Now you know where it ends. So reemerge, it might look like remerge if you don't have that hyphen. So there's also some suffixes that are also always hyphenated, like style, free, and based. So old style, dairy-free, and water-based. So when in doubt, look in a dictionary. Again, there's not really any easy memorization for hyphens. It's going to be specific from word to word, case to case. All right, and dashes are very similar looking to hyphens, but don't confuse them with hyphens. They're actually longer, and they appear in a few different ways depending on your word processor. So whatever program you're using, you're going to either use certain keys or it'll look a little differently. Some word processors you have to hit hyphen twice and space. Some processors it's just a hyphen and a space. So it'll look a little differently depending on what you're using, but just keep in mind it's a little bit longer than a hyphen and it's different than a hyphen. So they're very similar to parentheses and commas in that they add an emphatic thought into a sentence. So most editors and writers will agree that it's a little bit more emphatic than a comma or a parentheses. So parentheses downplays, comma adds non-essential information, and a hyphen adds like information that you want to emphasize. So you might say, it was him, the man with the scar. Or you might say, that dog was my companion, my only companion on the trip. So you see how that's a little bit more of a jarring interruption. You really want to drive home that this is an important point. That dog was my companion, my only companion. So you're saying it with a lot more emotion, a little bit more emotive than commas. So ellipses or singular ellipsis. Ellipses are the three dots that you see. It looks like three periods. And they take the place of omitted words or passages in a quote. This is their primary use. So this only happens for expediency. So this is only when you want to include only certain relevant information from a quote and everything else can be cut out. So the quote might be, if somebody's saying this, she went to the movies happy as could be with her friend. So if you're quoting somebody, like say in a newspaper, you might say, she went, ellipses, with her friend, because that's the most important part. So really, it's kind of subjective, case by case, how you use these as well. Just try to remember that it's cutting out non-essential. So they can also be used to represent, this is more in creative works, represent like a pause or a trailing off. So this is different from other punctuation in that it occurs in places that it shouldn't. So it can kind of occur anywhere when used like this. So this is whenever somebody's stuttering in a sentence or whenever they're pausing or whenever you want to emphasize that pause, this is when you use ellipses. So it isn't raining yet. So there's kind of like that little drop where you're saying yet is kind of a surprise. So, or when somebody's stuttering, you can say I don't know. So this is where ellipses are used. So this is it for punctuation.